I'm eager to have Max Lee from Genshin. So Max will do the bulk of the presentation, and then and it's a roughly 60-minute presentation, and then he'll be joined by his programmer, Ho for the Q&A portion of the presentation. So if we have a technical question and programmer question during the Q&A, they will be able to answer your question there. So happy Wise Tour, everyone, and please welcome Max Lee.
Um, Thanks for the introduction, Simon. I'm Max. I'm the audio director at miHoYo, and as Simon mentioned, I'm joined by Hodre, who's our programmer that we worked with for the bulk of Genshin Impact development. And today we'll be primarily talking about the audio in Genshin Impact. And I've labeled our presentation a retrospective because it's really during the preparation for this Wise Tour that I ended up having to review some of the initial goals that we had for audio and really look over kind of what we did during development in regards to those goals. So looking over what we did, I think the best way I can contribute to the audio community here is by talking about some of the challenges that we spent a bulk of our time during development trying to address, and some of maybe the unique questions that we thought of, and then sharing that and going into depth about how we actually went about solving it. So we're going to start by talking about Genshin Impact, the game itself. You can see that we have some pictures of the game. And Genshin Impact is an open world action RPG. You play as one of the two characters you see on the left side of the PowerPoint. So if you pick the male character, then the other one is your sister. And if you pick the female one, obviously it's your brother. And then you kind of go through this fantasy world called Tivat, where you kind of learn more about the world itself and kind of your relation with the characters inside and learning about the history of the world. And in the picture, the first screenshot you see here, that's Paimon, who is this fairy that you encounter as soon as you wake up in the world of Tivat. And she serves kind of as your guide as you venture through this world and filling you in on history regarding how the world came to be, about the dominance of these 7 elements which govern this world, their relation to everything, including the 7 major cities in the world, and this whole cast of characters that you eventually come across who are all affiliated with a specific element. And our game is fairly unique in that it's launched across mobile, on console, and on PC, because one of our major goals is trying to deliver this experience for as many players as possible. So we wanted that to not just be limited to the console or PC or only to mobile. And we just try to reach a global audience as well. And lastly, the game kind of follows the mobile kind of live service model. So we're constantly updating new content every 6 weeks. And we want to ensure that our story is unfolding right in front of the players rather than having a preset kind of story already there. And this also gives us a lot of freedom to explore a much longer story, because at launch, we only have maybe 2 of our 7 major cities available, and we'll have a much longer development cycle for the rest of the story that will come. So what does that actually mean for audio? And really, that's the first question we had to ask ourselves, and because it'll determine really what we do throughout our development cycle. And as we were brainstorming, 3 kind of concepts came up, and I want to go into depth about each of these 3 in the upcoming slides. And the first one is listenability, which I thought of as the general stylistic direction we wanted to take with the game, which is we wanted the game to be very pleasant and easy to listen to, because I feel like that would translate best to the open world concept that we have, where we kind of want players to spend prolonged periods of time in this world, and obviously the audio kind of has to match that. And the second goal is characterization. So as we mentioned, just with the basic premise of the game, there's lots of characters that inhabit this world of Tivat, and even concepts like our 7 elements play a very central role. And we really wanted to bring those to life as well. And so characterization is obviously a big part of our considerations. And the last one is actually maybe less to do with design and more to a lesser explored aspect of audio development, which is about our ideas on the pipeline and kind of how we set ourselves up for the audio that's to come in the future. And that's the idea of behind a continual development and continual design. And again, I plan on taking some time to go over each of these three concepts as it'll really frame kind of what we achieved, and we can then discuss whether what we did actually meets these goals. So with listen, so again, the first of our goals, the first theme that really came up and became core to a lot of our design decisions was listenability, which is about delivering a pleasant listening experience which actually engages all our players. And behind this goal, some of the early questions that came up was, for example, how do we deliver this experience across all platforms? As stated earlier, Genshin Impact is delivered across a very large range of hardware, all the way from probably lower end phones all the way up to probably higher end theater setups with consoles. And we wanted to make sure that the audio experience really matched or was really a coherent one across all these platforms, and that the experience that we wanted was translating even on phone speakers. So that was something we had to spend quite a bit of time just conceptualizing. And then related to that is, does fatigue actually become an issue with our sound design? Because if we're trying to design a soundscape that has to fit mobile platforms, that's obviously something we have to consider to make sure that even for longer gameplay sessions, audio isn't becoming a burden on the player. And then thirdly is, does our soundscape actually get stale? Because if we assume that fatigue does not become an issue and that we're actually engaging a player and they're wanting to listen to our game, then we need to provide content for them to engage with. And that's another question that I want to address in this presentation. So how do we actually deliver on mobile speakers? When we first started looking into this question, I think most people would really bring up the idea of the limited frequencies and how we have much less room to play with the asset design and kind of the mix in general. But early with our experimentation, I actually did not think this became a big issue, because for a lot of our design, we were able to replicate how a lot of our assets would sound via mobile in our DAWs by using an EQ that looks something like this. Again, it's a fairly steep cutoff on both the low end and the high end. And the idea is that as long as our assets sounded good with this filter turned on, then most of the information that we wanted to convey through audio would still translate on the mobile speakers. And the theme that kind of entered our collective conscious as a team is that we try and center all our information and all our design into the middle band of frequencies. And then we treat kind of the higher end and lower end frequencies as effects that we can use to punctuate certain sounds if needed. And probably the bigger concern that we had is with the dynamics, because the phone speakers actually aren't powered the same way as obviously larger speakers, so we weren't going to get much range out of them. And it's really in games, in my opinion, a lot of the time that where mobile games fail is that the range is too loud. So there's cases where the player is playing, they're hearing the loud sounds, and they're having to adjust their phone volumes in order to accommodate for that. And then as soon as they go to the quieter sections, they're finding that they can't hear anything. Then they would have to tweak the volume on the phone again. And if we do that, we kind of disrupt the immersive experience that we're trying to achieve for the players, accomplish for the players. And at a certain point, the player will get frustrated with having to constantly fiddle with their hardware and probably turn off their sound altogether, which is probably the worst result we can get. So we wanted to make sure that was never going to be an issue with Genshin Impact. So kind of the early decision that we decided on is something I would call a low dynamic range but high content variance approach to our design. Again, a lot of our storytelling then came across through our changes to the soundscape itself rather than trying to use volume as a tool to bring up or kind of calm down emotions. And that's something that I think has worked well for us, and we'll see that later in the presentation. And other topics relating to listenability that we kind of thought and had an impact on our design was we really ended up spending a lot of time thinking about the non-action moments. Again, because in most of the action scenes, it's quite easy to determine what we need to play with sound, and to in line with the dynamic our limited dynamic range, a lot of our efforts actually came down to simplifying what we wanted to convey for those more action-packed scenes. And for the non-action scenes, that's when we have to step up with our design, and that's when we needed to convey more information so that the soundscape had those non-action moments kind of rivals the intensity of, well, not necessarily rivals, but kind of matches content-wise the amount of information you're receiving in the more action-packed moments. And to take a tangent from that, essentially that involves us kind of finding ways to build audio stories that are independent from the mainline narrative. Because in the non-action moments, typically there's not much else driving the scene, right? Visually, there's things that are changing, but predominantly, we can assume that the players will actually be paying attention to audio because there's no story that they're immediately engaging with. There's probably nothing else in the environment that they have to engage with. And this is where audio really gets a chance to shine, and we know that the player will be listening to us. Overall, to fit in with our goal of listenability, we took a more kind of subdued approach to our asset design. It's not very in your face often. It's kind of just more toned back. It's pleasant to listen to. It's kind of just there. It's like a everyday conversation, if you will, with the game, rather than a more intense conversation where there's its highs and its lows. So it's more like a cruise rather than like a roller coaster. And then again, we placed a higher emphasis on delivering a very complete overall audio experience rather than trying to make individual moments stand out as a general theme. So that kind of covers our thoughts on listenability. The second topic we thought about was characterization, which I think is a fairly common goal for a lot of sound designers, which is just bringing out the identity for our various characters and our various cities. And again, I think most designers entering this field will already be thinking about this topic, and there's lots of research and information that's already been done about this topic. So I want to share kind of the parts that I feel were more unique to our thought process. And yeah, so one of the things we try to do with our soundscape is we have it centered around the player themselves rather than trying to communicate everything that's going on in the game. And again, this ties back into our theme of listenability, and that it kind of reduces the complexity of the overall mix and delivers a clearer focus for the player. And then we also thought about not necessarily adding new information about characters, but rather adding new dimensions based on how these characters would react in certain cases. And lastly, one of the concepts that was actually more interesting for us was when I was talking to one of our story designers, they brought up the point of direct and indirect characterization, and that changes. That the differentiation is mainly about how they for direct characterization, you kind of tell the player or tell the audience what you want them to know about the character. But with indirect characterization, it's about giving them hints, we're giving them ideas, we're having the certain aesthetics convey a thought, we're having the audience then having to unpack it for themselves, unpack what they're getting for themselves. And while most of our sound design kind of falls into more indirect characterization in the grand arc of storytelling, I kind of like this concept of direct versus indirect, even within our field of audio. So that was something we tried to play around with more for within Genshin Impact as well. So again, this kind of came down to a lot of our sound design choices within our asset design. So for example, with a character like Venti, who is our character associated with wind, a huge part of his skill design was revolved around the sounds of wind chimes. And the idea being that if you're hearing wind chimes, obviously there's wind around, right? And that kind of, using that line of logic, we can then convey what that Venti character is about. And then the to bring out the character of our world, we kind of thought about the impact that the player would have on the soundscape, and how when the player enters this world, how does the world change? Because obviously, without the player, the world kind of takes on a life of its own, and for it to feel like something that's real or a character, if something disrupts what's happening, obviously it has to have an impact, and it will respond to it. And the third concept that we kind of played with was viewing our UI design as a character. And this is actually something I think was a rather more interesting design story that we had, which is how we came to arrive at the UI sounds that we did. And we brought up the character of Paimon earlier in this presentation, and how she's a very central character to our game, and how she kind of guides your player avatar through the world of Tevat. And again, when I was chatting with our story designer, one of the questions that I posed to them early on was, if we were to integrate UI into the game, or assume that our UI is kind of part of the world of Tevat, then what would it be associated with as far as the in-game narrative goes? And they thought this was a weird question for one, but after giving it some thought, they responded with Paimon, because she kind of serves as a guide for a player, right? And that kind of parallels you as a player, how you interact with the game via the UI, in the same way that kind of your player protagonist avatar interacts with Tevat kind of through Paimon. So we really took that to heart and tried to make our UI sound as close to Paimon as possible. We'll really have Paimon be part of our UI design in general, rather than approaching UI as an extension of Tevat itself or the character of Genshin Impact. And lastly, with our live service model, one of the ideas that I really thought about was how our character will develop through each version. Because as soon as we're updating, then there's new information fed to the players regarding each of the characters that they will eventually attach themselves to, right? And I think a lot of what we try to do with sound design in regards to characters is we want our sound to really reflect what information that the player has regarding their character. And when that character changes, and over a long enough time frame, I think our sound design actually has to evolve to better represent that. So that's kind of the thoughts that we took with regards to characterization. And the last concept that we really played with was continual design, which I think is often referred to as continual development and integration. But I prefer the term design, because part of what we're trying to do with the game is have our sound design grow with each update. Again, right? Even though our game is launched, this is not what we expect the final quality of the audio in Genshin Impact to be. We're hoping that maybe a few years down the line, 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line, our sound design still holds up to players' expectations for games of that time period. So we have to set ourselves up before launch to ensure that we're able to achieve that. So the first question, obviously, is ensuring that we can meet the version deadlines. Right? So we have to at least guarantee that there's no missing sounds for any new characters, any new areas in the game, and at the bare minimum, that everything and that you see has sounds to reflect that. But on top of that, we were thinking about how we actually still maintain the quality of what we have right now in these shorter dev cycles. Again, where in each version we only have 6 weeks of time to build our characters or build our sound, which is actually substantially less than what we have during development. Yet the expectations are still just as high from the players, and we kind of needed ways where we need to set ourselves up in order to meet all these regular deadlines. And then lastly, on top of being able to maintain that quality, I feel like there are parts of the game which we have information that is told solely through audio, or that's where the goal of listenability really is to help convey audio at parts where maybe as far as the gameplay goes, it's more reliant on behavior from audio than rather on maybe gameplay or visuals. So these are kind of the 3 things we wanted to make sure we were able to address by setting ourselves up during our development phases. So really, a lot of our pre-production and production phase was spent on pipeline tools development and making sure that we can shorten a lot of our pipelines so that even post when we get to the launch, our each of our asset or feature pipelines could meet the shortened dev cycles. And we really placed a heavy emphasis on developing a transparent and solid tech foundation. The idea being that we wanted to be able to grow these functions to match the gameplay needs of the future. We needed to have a very, very good base in order to keep adding features. And if this wasn't solid, then we're eventually going to reach a point where adding one feature may mess with some of our previous features in unknown ways, and that's something that I was quite wary of, even in the beginning of our development. So that was a heavy emphasis that me and Hodre talked about during a lot of our development, to make sure that anything we developed was very clearly documented, it's easily understood, and we could add to it if we needed to, even with the shorter timeframes. And a lot of these concepts, we also had to make sure that our external teams understood them, and so they can set themselves up as well, knowing that even in going into the future, our expectations for ourselves is to make sure that our sound design is growing. It's not just delivering content for us. So we kind of shared these thoughts with our localization teams, our recording teams, and some of our asset content provider teams, so that they were all aware of what our plan was and the scope of this project. Right? It's a game that's intended to keep growing for years to come. It's not something that you kind of finish and then you move on to the next. And I think a lot of them really adopted this idea because when they heard about the overall story that we were trying to tell, they became very excited as well. And lastly, a lot of our conventions had to be future-proof, right? And what I mean by that is actually, essentially, we wanted the cost of communication and onboarding newer people to be less than what we would be for someone entering during development phases. And for people that may be coming back to the game after a few years away, we still want them to be able to easily reintegrate back into the team, for them to easily understand where they left off and be able to just pick up and reduce the amount of time spent on stuff like naming, stuff like just basic management overhead. And the other thought I had is ensuring that the quality that we were expecting for the future that actually requires innovation. If our team wasn't growing and our tech wasn't growing, and we did not come up with new ideas, our quality will actually immediately fall off, because during development phases, we actually get a lot of time to experiment and think, right? And that's how we can get to the quality that we have for launch. And understanding that the level that we reach in development is not enough, or thinking about that, is kind of what led me to the conclusion that in the future updates, we actually still need to find time to experiment and to remain creative, right? So that we can still have breakthroughs every now and then, or just new ideas flowing in that will allow our sound design to kind of keep up. Again, even if we ensure that a year from now, our feature quality, our asset quality matches what we have during production, that's not really going to hold up to the expectations of that time. So our team needs to have time in each version to really just try new things and have time for failure, even with the shorter dev cycles. And to me, that really meant that we had to automate a lot of the non-creative tasks. We have to focus what limited energy we get for each version on the more creative aspects of sound design. And since we weren't going to have time to revamp our pipelines once our game is launched, that's what we should spend our effort on before launch, because that's when we actually have the most time. And the last thing we thought about was really, in order to add new features to a launch scene, we needed more rigorous regression testing and making sure every feature that we launch works. Because there's not really going to be too much time down the line for us to say, oh, that doesn't work, let's tweak it. Or, oh crap, there's a bug, right? Because that's probably the worst experience we can deliver to the player, is something that's not something that matches our own expectations or their expectations. So that kind of sums up our goal for audio for for Genshin Impact, and kind of the three main things that we thought about and that really drove a lot of our decision making throughout the entire development, and it's kind of how our team frames all design going forward for this game. And how is this actually reflected in our implementation? Again, I'm going to try and talk more about the parts that I feel were unique to us rather than going over all the things we did. We just want to talk over the kind of the implementation of some of these core concepts or the implementation of certain features in our game that I think best reflects our thoughts on these concepts. So I'm going to start off with a video that I think kind of illustrates our ideas on listenability in the sense that there's just various assets or various things going on in the soundscape. So.
Mr. Draff always gets so drunk after a hunt.
If you ever want to trade tactics, I'm always ready.
Oh, sorry. So what did we hear? Sorry. So what did we hear? Well, we heard a lot of changes in the audio content, right? These were labeled in the video. We have some SFX that happens at the very beginning when the player moves around. As you wander through a different part of the world, you hear NPCs talking in the wilderness. You hear changes in the ambience, and you hear the player make sounds or the player's voices. And from a content perspective, that's kind of what I mean by the variance in the in the soundscape. But if we reframe that a bit, we thought of how these sounds were actually being triggered, right? There's some player-driven changes, such as based on how the player is controlling their character, whether they're changing their cameras or not, or even if they're actually moving or not, because even inaction causes players to make sounds, right? We hear the idle voices, which we have triggering between the range of maybe half a minute roughly. There's a randomized range to make the world seem more realistic. And then we also have some game state changes, right? Like how the wind speed and where you are physically in the world that will have an impact on what you hear. And again, we try and get more changes, or as much changes out of these as possible. And this is made quite easy with Wwise, so which we'll go into right now. So we're going to first talk about the movements of our character. And we're just going to talk about the flying sounds because this is I think, representative of a lot of what we did for the character. And for the flying sounds, we have a blend container set up with 3 layers of sounds. One for the kind of the flapping sounds that we heard when the player was turning directions. We have a general looping sound that represents when the character is flying. And then there's some winds that go by. And these 3 are all set up as random containers with randomized duration rather than a straight loop, as I feel like this gets much more variation and we can have room to play with them dynamically in the game. So the first thing we see here is our flapping layer. And you can see that we have it set up connected to a parameter called fly speed, which we defined as how fast you were going and you were flying, as well as the direction you were flying in. And when it's set to 0, that essentially means you're flying straight. And when it's at 2, that means you're both turning direction and you're flying faster. And 1 is just the middle ground where you're not turning, but you are flying. And you can see that with the flapping sound, really it only comes into play when you start turning. And for the next layer of sound, this is the basic loop that represents that you're flying. And for this sound, it kind of remains fairly constant throughout. There's slight changes to it based on your flying speed. And really the volume drops down to make space for the flap sound. But for the last layer, with our wind sounds, this is the one we played most with, and we changed the duration, like basically how frequently our wind sounds was being triggered. And if we're flying if we're flying slower, we would figure that the loop would come down, but then we would need to trigger the wind sounds a bit more. And when we tie those all together, we kind of get a lot of change, even based on just minor changes in the player behavior, where visually, when there's not much happening, audio changes substantially more, adding a lot of more things for the players to pay attention to. And we can kind of see that illustrated in our next video. And again, this is a video that's going to monitor our RTPCs and play back our flying character. And this concept, as you can see, is it just allows our basic actions to have a lot more just variation, right? And we kind of apply this concept, as you saw in the video, in our first video, to ideas as well, like climbing, where the direction you're climbing in, the angle that you're looking at, will all have an effect on what you hear, and that doesn't necessarily have to reflect what's happening in the game, right? It's more a representation of the character's changes. And then next, we're going to talk about the changes in our ambience. And again, this kind of mirrors what we did with the characters, right? A lot of this is set up with game syncs and Wwise, except for our ambiences. A lot of these RTPCs are applied more globally, so that we're affecting multiple different sound objects at once, so that they kind of based on a simple change, right? And we're going to demonstrate this with our wind speed. So for our winds, we have a basic blend track setup that just kind of changes from soft to heavy winds and the crossover between the two. But the interesting thing that we did with the ambience is that there's other things that happen when the wind changes, right? So apart from the wind picking up, things like windmills will potentially go faster. So you can see with our next 2 pictures, we kind of have our windmill set up in the same way as our flying sounds, with randomized containers with triggers a duration set up. And we can see that as our winds gets faster, the sound of each individual fan on the windmill is triggered more frequently, and it just ends up sounding like it's spinning faster. And again, the next slide is also another layer within our windmill sound, this time covering the basic loop. And these things combined together kind of makes the wind in our world feel more realistic, right? It has an impact in the world. And apart from impacting things like windmills, this other impact of the wind is that our birds fly away, right? When the wind picks up, birds typically aren't staying in these trees, right? They kind of find shelter. So you can see with our bird sounds, as the wind picks up to after the wind picks up to a certain level, the birds they don't make sounds anymore. And I think it's really ideas like these littered throughout the world that kind of brings various zones and areas in our world to life. And here we can see kind of a list of some of the RTPCs that we ended up using to drive these minor ecosystems and drive these mini stories that we have in the world. Again, you can see here there are some ideas like the time of day, which would impact kind of the kind of wildlife that's available or that kind of appears. And when we get into cities, this will determine whether the characters in the cities, the NPCs, they're awake or not, what they're saying. Maybe some guy is drunk at night, his line will reflect that. And ideas like maybe certain shops, they might not be open in the day. And again, all of these, just having one RTPCs allows us to play with game ideas like that and affecting lots of different sounds at once. And then we also have states and switches set up for higher level changes, whereas we used RTPCs a lot for these minor tweaks. And you can see those listed here. Again, similarly, a lot of our game syncs was spent on driving our ambience. And lastly, we have certain things that aren't being used yet, but we know will be integrated for the future zones, such as our game's zones ideas and our cave auxiliary. And these are just to make sure that our future regions, they are getting the support they will need that we can already foresee. So again, we have another video. This time, this is going to reflect kind of a typical player's experience as they travel through the world. And hopefully you can hear some of the changes in the ambience and how the world is really just is reacting to your player's performance. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the conclusion for kind of the stuff we try to achieve with our ambience and how we try to just add variance even when the players aren't doing much and there's not too much happening visually. And Next topic we're going to talk about is characterization. And I think a huge part of characterization obviously comes down to to asset design, right, or to their voice actor selection and the music composition. And for us, for each of our characters, we do have like Foley recordings and new sound libraries created for each of them. But I don't think that's necessarily something that we did particularly differently. I think most games kind of do this as well. And we also have a composer that's in-house that's kind of working closely with the game, again, kind of making sure that they're capturing the right feel for each of these cities and the characters that may need themes as part of their storyline reveal. But instead, I kind of want to take two different angles to how we thought about characterization. And one, we're going to talk about our VO pipeline, and the other, we're going to talk about um, how the idea of characterization affected our mix. And I'm choosing the VO pipeline to talk about primarily because I think for a game like ours with kind of the anime aesthetic, it's really the voice actor who will do most of the storytelling, right? The narrative is propelled primarily by the voice actress and voice actors. And for us in audio, as long as we can get those sounds reliably and quickly from the recording booth into the game, then that's the best thing we can do to support our narrative, right? So we actually ended up spending time trying to make sure that this part of our pipeline is working very stably and very quickly. The idea being that we want to review our characters in the game setting to make sure they were coming to life, right, rather than just hearing them in the booth. So we kind of overhauled our pipeline to match the game design more, so that it's easier for other members of our game design team to be part of this discussion and to understand the terms that we would be using to talk about whether the voices fit the various part of the game. We also had to think quite a bit about the prioritization management for the voices, because we have quite a few gameplay modules that all called for the use of voice, because most game designers or most storytellers inherently understand the value of dialogue. And they all kind of wanted to use voice as part of that design. And we wanted our pipeline to, again, address the issue of overhead, right? We did not want the manual parts of the pipeline to be something that we had to spend a lot of effort on, or take up a lot of our designers' time on. So really, we ended up looking at the entire voice pipeline, all the way from recording down to hooking it up, and trying to make sure that we can get this as quick as possible and as error-free as possible. And what we ended up choosing to do was use the Wwise external source system, because it allowed us to solve a lot of the issues that we brought up previously. First of all, it would significantly reduce the event management overhead, because we only had like one event for all of our voices in the game. And then it also allowed Hodra to build what you would call the one throat system, or the idea where we would have only one line of dialogue coming from any one character at a given time to really mirror the physics, right? And this was essentially a set of rules that was written in the code that would govern which gameplay module kind of had first dibs on playing the voice. And this was set up. We were working closely between the designer and him to make sure that it was behaving normally in the game. But obviously, to make our external source work, we created an editor to also support the editing of any of the voice that goes into the game. And there is a failsafe added against the one throat system to make sure that in the case that a specific line is more integral to the story, then we would be able to have that override anything else that's already in the queue to be triggered. So yeah, this is a basic look at how our editor looks. And really, it's big because that we have this editor that we are able to then create a lot of these surrounding tools that sped up various aspects of the pipeline that aim to automate stuff like script creation, importing, localization, and stuff like that. And we can demonstrate that using the video that we have here next. And there's some parts of this that are kind of blurred out for privacy concerns, really, because our game is a recently launched game, and there's still some issues surrounding that.
This is bad. Such a hassle. What am I going to do? Oh, thank the thousand winds. Your arrival must be the grace of the gods. If I may ask, envoy sent by the Animo god to save this mere mortal, could you spare a moment?
Ew, cut it out.
I cannot let my peers hear about this. I cannot seek help from anyone else but you.
Yeah, so as you can see, most of our pipeline is actually can be automated at this point, so that as soon as we get our recordings, it takes less than a day to really start hearing what it sounds like in our game. And that really allows everyone in the team, from the story writers to the game designers, to see if these character performances were really adding to our narrative. And I feel this is a very powerful way that we can contribute to making sure the narrative is being conveyed to our players, because this also gives us enough time, even in the shorter dev cycles, to do extra takes if needed. And this also allowed us to actually get all our localization files on time as well for each version update, so that we actually have all the dialogue for any region in the world, really, for the 4 languages that we're supporting, released on time rather than a version behind. So the other topic in characterization that we wanted to show was how it affected our gameplay mix. Again, falling in line with our other concept of listenability, we're going to show a video of combat which focuses on the player and on simplifying what's happening on screen.
Nice and spicy.
Keep back!
Incoming. You're toast.
Get back!
Time for takeoff. With sword comes shadow.
So just in that video itself, I hope we kind of gathered a few things that may be slightly different for our game, which is that we actually had lengthier lines of dialogue in general, because we wanted to add to the character expression more than the combat itself. And in terms of our mixed priority, there's actually a much heavier emphasis on anything that relates to our player. So obviously character VO stuck out at the forefront, but ideas like absorbing the element orbs, swapping characters, UI sounds like those which have more to do with characterization rather than the combat experience were more heavily emphasized, as well as having the boss's voice kind of play out a bit more. And as far as the technique behind this, we just stuck with using side chains with the meters and Ys to achieve this. And one example that we have here is for those element word sounds, which are used to kind of compress almost everything else in the mix so that it stands out. This is a demonstration of our music bus. So a lot of the music actually gets toned down a bit just to make way for our character related stuff like UI. And that kind of sums up our ideas on characterization. And the last topic we're going to talk about is kind of an idea that we came up with in line with our continual design philosophy. And well, initially we were quite proud of what we achieved, but listening to Simon talk earlier, it's actually very similar to what Audio Kinetic ended up creating. So we might be talking about very similar ideas here, and so I might go through this a bit quicker. And the idea was that for a game like Genshin Impact, for open world game, we could not think of a good way to divide our assets among the sound banks. Because if we try to divide our assets based on where we expect the players to go, like we would for a level-based game, we often found that during testing we could not get sounds triggering. There was often missing sounds that we could not find because we did not account for a specific action that the player might take at a certain point in the game. So, but if we try to divide our sound banks based on each character word, each monster word, each scene, that often led to very massive memory usage, which becomes a very big problem on mobile because the budget that we have is very small, especially for iOS. So in the end, the only thing that really worked for us was having a high level of granularity for our sound banks. Again, in the end, we came pretty much having one sound bank per asset. But that led to, again, overhead, because for each version we're adding hundreds if not thousands of sounds, and if we're manually having to create thousands of these sound banks, that's not really going to sustain, right? It's very easy to not be to fail somewhere along the line, and which would massively impact the player experience. Yet, assuming we do a very good job of this, we spend a lot of designers' time managing this, there's actually very little upside that's brought, right? Because managing these sound banks will only guarantees that the experience we want to deliver remains the same. Managing this well does not actually elevate the experience for the players. So it's not something we wanted to spend a lot of time, a lot of the designer's time, especially when it's prone to human error. So again, like kind of similar to what Simon was talking about, we kind of created an automated sound bank creation and allocation system. And that essentially just divides all our assets based on how we might need them and creates kind of this lookup chart based on when they're being used in the game. And having that kind of guarantees that our sound banks don't really run into issues of not being able to trigger sounds even in future versions of our game. And sound bank management essentially is not something that's part of our regular design considerations anymore. But after achieving that, we found out just having that many sound banks causes our generation time to skyrocket. Right? Having one sound bank is substantially faster than having like 10 sound banks, even if the total content is the same. So eventually, we moved this actually away from our development. We created two separate lines of packaging. Right? There's one that our developers, our sound designers, use internally, and then there's a sound bank division system for when we actually have to package and deploy for the game, in order to just save the time that the designers have. And we eventually moved this also to the server side, the division aspect of it, to make sure that there's really not much room for error, and while saving the designer's time. But obviously, for our QA and for our sound designers, we would have to test both versions locally, and Hodra made that available to us as well, which really allowed us to eliminate any time on managing these sound banks, which really don't elevate our audio design in any way. So yeah, that's basically kind of our thoughts on implementing some of the core concepts that we had early in our development. And so how do these actually relate to storytelling, which is the theme of this Wwise Tour? Well, the first idea is obviously that audio has its own story to tell, right, in the game. There's parts of the game where audio should take the lead to inform the player what's happening. There's times that we need to work with visuals and narrative and gameplay to cohesively tell a story. But there's also moments in our game where visuals get to shine. There's also moments where audio has to shine. So really, it's about finding where we need to shine and forming a connection with the players that we have to find where we know they will be paying attention, where they want more from our audio. And our job in this part is really to just provide more information about the game world through sound, right? Helping players understand concepts which are harder to represent through visuals, which are harder to represent through gameplay. And in the parts of the game where it's very clear that there's a central narrative which that player will latch on, then for us in audio, it's really about supporting that, right? We use our audio expertise to help make sure that the narrative is being conveyed using as many of our senses as possible. And finally, because the story of Genshin Impact is ongoing and it's revealing itself to the players, we have to set up our audio team to also be able to keep contributing to that story, right? Assuming that audio does have we have our own stories to tell, we really need to we need to make sure that we find ways to allow it to grow similar to how our stories will naturally grow with each version, similar to how there's more gameplay modules for each version. And in closing, we have one more final video which kind of shows a newer content in Genshin Impact that hopefully kind of conveys the new development that occurred opposed to the very first video we had.
Auto reconfiguration is an essential function.
What are you staring at?
What's the hurry? Catch the wind.
Feast your eyes on this super fresh fish.
My harbor is so lovely. So many treasures.
Cool. And that concludes our presentation. And well, thank you for listening. And our HR asked us to add this part to our slide. And yeah, thanks everyone.
So that's probably the main difference between doing the event live versus online. So there's not much feedback from the audience. Hey, Max, that was a fantastic presentation. Really, really great presentation. I've got a few notes before getting to the Q&A. Well, first of all, like just looking at like what people were writing on the chat and so on, there's a lot of love for you guys and for the game. So a lot of positive comments and so that was great there. And by the way, I've seen a few times a presentation of voice pipeline explain over PowerPoint and so on. You definitely have the best presentation ever for a voice pipeline with music and flow, and like it was dramatic. That was great. So fantastic. And it's interesting. I was taking notes and so on, and looking at the question. There's a lot of question where we're almost at the same place. So just looking at my notes. So yeah. So I really like when you said that you're thinking the development of the character through the version update of the game. So this is quite interesting, and there's a few other people that chime in with that thing as well. So maybe we can start with that. So So the game has been released recently, so I don't know how many updates you've been able to plan and how much character customization or progression you've been able to inject already. So maybe we can start with that one. So how much of that character evolution have you been able to do since the release of the game?
Not too much as of yet. There's plans maybe, well, actually, I can't reveal when down the line, but relatively soon down the line. And it comes in several forms, right? At its most basic, it's really you get more lines of dialogue based on how they interact with different characters, right? And maybe even as part of their backstory, we might learn more about where they're physically from, where they were born, and that information will slowly unfold itself as well, right? And then based on new information that you learn about these characters, maybe some characters that seem potentially friendly initially might not be, right? And that would obviously have to play into how we design these characters, sound effects, maybe even some of the lines down the line, right? They would have to reflect the new information that the players understand.
Yeah. Okay, I see. So it's a lot of it goes through the dialogue themselves and the
Quite a
narrative.
bit of it, yeah, yeah.
I see. I see.
But maybe
Great.
even some of the skills will change in their character as well, right? Just how we choose to characterize it, because it might have to reflect a newer aspect that the players learn.
Yeah. So you've been showing a lot of tools that have been developed to help the production and help basically your team making sure that they focus on the assets, on the quality, and so on, and not that much on technicalities and so on. So how many programmers were working on that? Was it just you, Hojoe, or you had a full team of programmers working on those tools?
You can answer that.
We have several excellent colleagues working with me.
Okay, okay. Yeah, it shows because that was, yeah, I can see the amount of customization and the amount of effort you've put into that, and it seems quite solid. That's great. Um, so another person was mentioning, so what does the dev pipeline looks like for the audio team during your 6 week release cycle? So do you have all the features updated and confirmed during the first week, or is it something that evolved throughout the 6 weeks? So can you explain a bit how the 6 week goes?
Sure. Well, planning stages for each of these 6 weeks actually occurs like before the start of that version, right? We kind of have ideas on what the gameplay features are going to be, what characters we might release, and then with that information, our audio team starts brainstorming how we want to like communicate that to the players, right? We start thinking of potential features that we would need from code, source material that we would need to record, because even within the six weeks, any character that we create, we want new material that represents them, right? We saw with the characters in the characterization slide, they all have their own Foley sounds, and even for the new characters, that's something we have to maintain, right? But the idea is that we find out what we need to do before that 6 weeks, so that 6 weeks is dedicated to all the creative process. And maybe we have a few audio QA as well working with us directly, so that they're kind of looped in early on, so that we don't have to cram maybe at the very end, leave a week or two for them to test. They're kind of testing with us during that entire process. Again, the idea is that we needed to have very, very solid regression testing, right? Not just bundled up at the end and be like, yeah, it's probably safe. No, we want it to be 100% safe.
Yeah. With a game that large anyway, that's necessary to have that, definitely. So we had a series of questions all surrounding around the various platforms you're releasing on, and especially on the mixing side of things. So how much are you customizing your mix per platform? And more specifically on mobile, are you prioritizing the mobile speakers versus the consumer headphones that are distributed with those phones? So what is your strategy with regards to your default platform or your lead platform?
Our lead platform is probably the mobile platform, because in my mind, that was probably the biggest challenge to address, right? And to an extent, the most fun, right? Because it's the area that there's like least knowledge accumulated. So that's the thing we wanted to tackle first. And then once we have that sitting somewhere we like, then we can start developing for specific platforms, right? And that's something we spend time. We're going to continue spending time on really for PC and for our console versions. We want to get them sounding even better than what we have them sounding currently and compared to mobile. But one of our initial goals was to make sure that the mobile experience could be at a good quality, right? That has to meet. It can't just be standard mobile affair, right? Because most mobile experiences are more chunk sized, right? Where you can enjoy it you sit down for a match or two, and then you can kind of just take a break, right? Before our game, that's not the intent. So we really need to make sure that the mix could reflect the player's experience, and then build from that.
I see. So when you were doing final decision for a mix, were you taking that decision with your high quality speakers in the studio or listening to your phone and deciding if you should lower or augment the volume of certain sounds, for example?
More on the phone. We did the initial mix maybe on the higher end speakers because everyone wants to work with the higher end speakers, right? But then we would have to then test it through the phones as well, right? To make sure that it's translating, because the last thing we would want is something that sounds good on speakers, but then not on the phone, and then people playing on the phone telling us that it doesn't sound good. And our response to that cannot be go buy better speakers, right? That's not really an appropriate response. Right?
Certainly not, exactly. Great. So another question we had was, with the beeping navigation sound in the game, how do you ensure the player doesn't get listener fatigue?
Those are more one-offs, really. Those are more attached to the specific area and matching that element, right? It's when one of the, I don't know what they're called in English actually, but one of those character orbs, or the orbs that you would need to power up your statue, right? It's a notification, and as soon as you pick it up, it doesn't happen again. So that is a one-off experience, and as soon as the player is kind of done exploring that area, they probably won't hear it again.
I see. Great. So maybe one last question regarding music this time. So since each world has a very distinct musical color, how do you ensure smooth transitions in the music as the player goes between the different worlds without being disruptive?
That's actually a fairly complex question. We can kind of break it down into gameplay related and non-gameplay related sides. For the gameplay side, there's kind of two ways you can transition between worlds, right? There's teleporting, and then there's just you physically walking and transitioning between the wilderness, right? If you're just walking between the wilderness, the color and the transition is much more gradual, because it's really in the main city that we're getting the most of the character coming through. And the surrounding areas are reflections of that character, but maybe not as intense. It's not going to be looping, right? In the wilderness, our music comes and goes. So in those situations, in the first time playthrough, as you're walking through the world, it happens much more naturally. But if you're teleporting from one world to the other, from one maybe the first city of Mondstadt to Lyria, the transition it's just a time frame that we feel is kind of appropriate for that transition, but it's a much harder cut.
I see. And I just stumbled on maybe one last question for real this time, and it's about CPU and memory impact when working with the platform mobile. And I'm assuming you were covering a broad range of mobile devices. So how did you manage that? So have you developed for the lowest common denominator, which I'll be surprised if you did, and if not, how did you balance reducing the amount of memory and CPU on certain lower mobile devices versus high-end mobile devices?
We actually don't have that much difference between low-end and high-end mobile devices. And the unified criteria is 30 meg of memories on iOS and Android.
Okay.
That is quite a low criteria, I guess. And to achieve that, we just divided all the sound banks into 7,000 or so sound banks to assure that only those needed are loaded at any time.
Yeah, I guess so. And that falls with what you've shown with the sound bank management just before the end of your presentation. Wow. Well, thank you very much. There were much more questions and comments, but that's the time we had for that. You started quite early in the morning from Shanghai to attend the Wwise Tour. So thank you for waking up that early for us and presenting that. Great presentation. Well, no wonder why the game is so successful with people so dedicated. So thank you very much again. And so now comes the time where we'll take a break. We'll